Judge Frank Caprio had barely settled into his seat that morning when the atmosphere of the courtroom shifted in a way he couldn't ignore. The sunlight pouring through the tall windows cast long golden streaks across the room, but instead of creating warmth, it felt sharp and unforgiving, as if the day itself sensed what was coming. Officers flipped through their paperwork, spectators adjusted their seats, and yet a strange tension hovered like a quiet warning in the air. Then the clerk called the next case, and a young woman stepped forward a moment, so subtle, yet so powerful that even people who weren't paying attention suddenly turned their heads. She walked carefully, almost cautiously, with the fragile movements of someone who had spent every last ounce of strength just getting there. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hair tied back the way someone ties it when running late, and her breathing unsteady, the kind that comes from emotional exhaustion rather than physical effort. But what caught the room wasn't her clothes nor her steps, it was her eyes. They carried a depth of fear, fatigue, and heartbreak that instantly silenced the typical shuffling noise of the courtroom. And then the room noticed the small boy clinging to her hand, no older than 6, gripping her fingers with the desperate certainty that letting go would mean losing everything. His innocent eyes scanned the room with confusion, vulnerability, and a quiet bravery that no child his age should ever have to summon. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his intuition immediately alert. He had seen thousands of faces stand before him, but some carried a weight that demanded closer attention. And this woman carried that weight in every trembling breath. When she reached the podium and tried to speak, her voice cracked as she whispered, "Good morning, Your Honor," revealing not a routine greeting, but the breaking point of someone who had been fighting battles no one else could see. Her hands trembled around the paperwork. Her son pressed closer to her leg, as if trying to protect her with the little strength he had. And the entire courtroom unconsciously quieted, as though bracing for a truth none of them expected. No one knew her name yet. No one knew the storm she had walked through to stand there. But what they didn't realize, what not even she realized, was that hidden inside her case file was something extraordinary. Something that would make Judge Caprio stop mid-sentence, lower his pen, and reconsider every assumption he had made in the first few seconds of seeing her. And once he discovered it, the entire courtroom would fall into a silence so complete that even the ticking of the clock on the wall would seem too loud, as the young woman tried to steady her breathing. Judge Frank Caprio gently lifted the first page of her file, his eyes scanning the surface details that most people assumed defined a case date's violations, fines, outstanding balances, but something about the way she stood there made him linger longer than usual, as if the paperwork couldn't possibly contain the real story. The courtroom watched her closely, not out of judgment, but out of an instinctive awareness that this wasn't going to be an ordinary exchange. Her shoulders were tense, pulled inward, carrying a heaviness that made her seem smaller than she was. And every few seconds, she squeezed her son's hand, as though reminding herself she wasn't facing this alone. The little boy, with his oversized hoodie and nervous fidgeting, scanned the courtroom with wide eyes full of fear and confusion, silently trying to understand why his mother's voice trembled or why grown adults were staring at them with a mixture of worry and curiosity. Judge Caprio noticed the boy immediately and softened his expression, offering a faint, reassuring smile before turning his attention back to the mother. The charges against her were simple on-paper 3 unpaid parking violations, 1 late appearance, and a bench warrant that had been automatically issued when she missed her previous court date, but nothing about her presence matched the coldness of the printed words. The fines weren't astronomical, but for someone in her position, even small amounts could build into a mountain. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice, and when she finally did, it cracked mid-sentence, revealing a depth of stress no legal document could ever capture. She explained, in fragmented pieces, that she worked 2 jobs, that her shifts changed constantly, that she had no one to watch her son, that her car was unreliable, but essential to their survival. And that missing the earlier court date wasn't. Disrespect it was a desperate choice between taking her sick son to the clinic or risking losing her job. As she spoke, her son tugged gently at her sleeve, burying his face against her side, and several people in the courtroom exchanged glances, realizing that her story was already heavier than her fines. Judge Caprio listened without interruption, not just to her words, but to the pauses between them, the quiver in her throat, the way she held her breath after every sentence like she was bracing for punishment. And as he turned the next page of her file, he noticed something unusual, something that made his brow tighten with concern. Something hidden behind a stamped date that didn't quite line up with her explanation. Something that hinted there was far more beneath the surface of this case than even she understood. Judge Frank Caprio paused longer than usual as he examined the file, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly, not in suspicion, but in concern. The kind that comes from years of reading people more than papers. Something wasn't aligning: the dates, the missed court appearance, the sudden spike in penalties. Details that looked routine on the surface, but felt wrong when paired with the trembling woman standing before him. He lifted his gaze slowly, studying her expression with the same care a doctor gives a patient who's pretending they're fine. Her breathing remained shallow, her fingers gripping the edge of the podium like she was holding on to the last piece of stability she had left. And her son pressed himself even closer to her leg, as though he could sense the fear she was trying so hard to hide. The judge cleared his throat softly, a habit he had when he shifted from procedural duty to genuine human curiosity, and asked her to walk him through what happened in her own words. His voice wasn't stern. It carried that quiet warmth he was known for, the kind that invited honesty without pressure. The woman hesitated, not because she wanted to hide anything, but because she didn't know where to begin her life. Like her file, had become tangled in complications she didn't fully understand herself. As she attempted to explain the sequence of events, Judge Caprio noticed her glance repeatedly toward the door, as if afraid something or someone might appear. He noticed how her voice dropped whenever she mentioned her workplace, and how she clutched her son's hand tighter whenever she mentioned her missed court date. These weren't signs of negligence, they were signs of someone living in survival mode. The judge leaned back slightly, tapping the corner of her paperwork with subtle, deliberate rhythm, and the room sensed his shift from routine judge to empathetic investigator. He wasn't just listening. He was piecing together a puzzle she didn't know she had given him. Then, almost imperceptibly, his expression changed, a flicker of surprise, followed by a tightening around his eyes, because, as he turned to the third page of her file, he saw something that shouldn't have been there. Something that hinted her situation was far more complicated than unpaid tickets or scheduling conflicts. Something that made him stop reading mid-sentence. And though the courtroom couldn't see what he saw, they could all sense it. Something had caught Judge Caprio's attention in a way that rarely happened. And whatever it was about to change how he approached the entire case. As the courtroom waited in a tense, uncertain quiet, the young woman lowered her eyes, gathering the strength to explain the parts of her story that no official document had captured. And when she finally began to speak, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been fighting battles in silence for far too long. She explained how things had unraveled over the past year, first losing her stable job when the company downsized, then scrambling between two part-time shifts that never aligned, each one barely paying enough to keep the lights on. She spoke of how her ex-partner had left without warning, leaving her alone with a child who cried for him every night, until he eventually understood that crying wouldn't bring him back. She talked about sleeping only 4 or 5 hours after late-night cleaning shifts, waking before dawn to get her son ready for school, then racing across the city in a car that coughed and stalled more often than it started. The first ticket happened the morning her son had a fever so high she panicked and rushed him to the clinic, only to return to a slip tucked under her windshield. The second came during a night shift when she parked on the wrong side of the street, too exhausted to notice the sign. The third happened on a morning when the school called her to come immediately because her son had collapsed from dehydration. And she left her car running outside the building without realizing parking enforcement had passed by. Each violation wasn't carelessness, was survival. She had tried to pay the first fine, scraping together what she could. But when her hours at work were cut again, even groceries became a calculation. She described nights when the refrigerator held little more than milk, bread, and worry. She admitted missing her earlier court date not because she didn't care, but because that very morning she had gotten a call from her manager threatening to replace her. If she didn't show up for an emergency shift, she stood there trembling, reliving moments she had tried so hard to forget, each memory carving deeper into her voice until it shook uncontrollably. And all the while, her little boy squeezed her hand, his round eyes fixed on her with a protective fear no child should ever feel. As she revealed each struggle, each sacrifice, each impossible choice, the courtroom's perception shifted. She wasn't a careless violator, a foul. She was a mother trying to keep her world from collapsing while standing on ground that was crumbling beneath her feet. And with every word she spoke, Judge Caprio's expression softened further. Not out of pity, but out of recognition of someone who had been buried under circumstances far beyond her control. Someone whose fines were only the surface of a much deeper story. Judge Frank Caprio. Listen to her trembling voice with the kind of stillness that only comes from decades of witnessing stories unfold behind courtroom podiums, but as she spoke, he sensed there was something she wasn't saying, something that lived between her pauses. In the way her eyes hesitated every time she glanced at her son, in the quick swallow she made before continuing, as though she was holding back more than the room could yet understand. He gently encouraged her to take her time, reminding her that his courtroom wasn't a place of intimidation, but a place where truth had room to breathe. And at that reassurance, something inside her seemed to crack open. She took a slow, shaky breath, clenched her hands together, and lowered her voice as she revealed the moment everything had truly begun to fall apart. It wasn't just the job loss or the long hours, or the impossible schedule. There was something else, something far more painful. She admitted that after her ex-partner abandoned them, he occasionally returned only to take money, raising his voice and pounding on her door so loudly that her little boy hid in the closet, covering his ears, shaking uncontrollably. She explained that the morning she missed her court date was the very same morning he had shown up, furious, demanding money she didn't have, threatening to take their son if she didn't give him what he wanted. Terrified of what he might do, she had grabbed her child, fled the apartment, and hidden at her sister's place until he left the neighborhood. Her voice broke as she described holding her son in her arms, rocking him while he cried, telling him everything would be okay, though she didn't believe it herself. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound that even the officers stopped moving, their pens frozen mid-air, as if the air itself refused to interrupt her story. Judge Caprio slowly exhaled, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. And for the first time, he understood why the dates in her file didn't line up, why the fines had spiraled, and why her entire demeanor carried the tremble of someone living in constant fear. But what truly caught him off guard was what she said next, because as she apologized for failing to appear in court, her son tugged at her sleeve and whispered something so quietly that only she and the judge could hear. A small, frightened confession that made Judge Caprio straighten in his seat and place the file down with deliberate care. In that tiny voice, spoken from the heart of a child who had seen too much, was the final piece of truth the courtroom didn't expect. The piece that would shift the entire case into something far more serious than unpaid tickets. The moment the little boy whispered those fragile words, A subtle but undeniable shift rippled through the courtroom. The kind of shift that makes every person instinctively straighten in their seat even before they fully understand why. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward, his expression tightening in a way that only happened when a case carried stakes far higher than the paperwork implied. And he gently asked the boy if he could repeat what he'd said, not to pressure him, but to give him space to speak if he felt safe. The boy hesitated, glancing up at his mother with wide, frightened eyes, and when she nodded softly, he lifted his tiny voice just enough for the judge to hear. Mommy was scared he'd come back. The room froze. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to dull as the weight of that single sentence settled over everyone like a heavy blanket. Judge Caprio's brows creased with a deeper concern as he glanced between mother and child, suddenly noticing every detail he hadn't focused on before. The faint bruise near the woman's collarbone partially hidden by her jacket. The way she flinched at sudden sounds in the hallway. The dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent listening for footsteps outside her door. The judge's tone shifted, becoming a blend of authority and empathy as he asked whether there had been any formal reports, any restraining orders, any attempts at legal protection. Her answer was a defeated shake of the head, explaining that she never filed anything because she couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't risk involving authorities, couldn't risk her ex finding out she had spoken to anyone. Fear had chained her silence more effectively than any legal barrier could. As she spoke, one of the officers at the side of the courtroom exchanged a tense glance with his partner. The kind of exchange that said they were now hearing more than a simple violation. The atmosphere thickened with the unspoken awareness that this was no longer about fines. This was about safety, about a woman and child living under the constant threat of someone who treated fear as a weapon. Judge Caprio's fingers tapped the wooden bench, slow and deliberate, as he processed each new revelation. And the courtroom watched him with held breath, knowing this was the moment where the case teetered between routine judgment and something far more serious. The mother clasped her son's hand tightly, apologizing through tears for bringing him here, for letting him hear things a child shouldn't hear, for not being stronger, her voice cracking each time she tried to steady it. And as she stood trembling under the fluorescent lights, Judge Caprio recognized the unmistakable truth. She wasn't just asking for leniency on fines. She was silently begging for protection, for understanding, for someone to finally see the danger she had been living in. The tension in the room reached a point where even the judge's seasoned composure seemed to strain, because now he faced a turning point he couldn't simply issue a verdict without first uncovering the full truth lurking behind this woman's fearful silence. Judge Frank Caprio took a slow breath, letting the rising tension settle inside him before he spoke. And when he finally lifted his eyes from the file, something profoundly human shone through, a blend of compassion, sorrow, and the quiet determination of a man who had spent his life reminding people that justice was not merely the mechanical application of rules, but the moral obligation to see the person behind the problem. He folded his hands gently on the bench, leaning forward with the steady kindness of someone who understood that even the strongest people sometimes arrived in court carrying invisible wounds. Looking directly at the trembling mother, he softened his voice in a way that made the entire room feel smaller and safer, telling her that in his courtroom she didn't need to be afraid of speaking the truth, that no one here would allow harm to come to her or her child, and that she was not alone, not today, not in his presence. The woman's lips quivered as she tried to hold back tears, her shoulders collapsing slightly as if those few words had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for far too long. Judge Caprio gently addressed her son as well, lowering his tone to the level of a child, assuring him that he was brave, that he had done nothing wrong, and that his mother was trying her very best to protect him, even when things were difficult. The boy blinked up at him, confused but comforted, as though hearing kindness from someone in authority was a new experience. Then the judge leaned back, silent for a few moments, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to choose words that could reach her heart. Words that came not from a judge's bench, but from a father's understanding. He told her that raising a child alone was one of the hardest battles a person could fight, that her exhaustion wasn't a sign of weakness, but of resilience, and that the fact she was standing here today, despite everything pushing against her, was a testament to her strength. His voice wavered slightly, just enough for the courtroom to sense how deeply the situation touched him. And he admitted that the justice system wasn't perfect, that sometimes the people who needed the most help were the ones most afraid to ask for it. But in his courtroom, he promised she would be met with fairness and humanitarian judgment. As he spoke, a hush fell over the room, the kind of silence that only forms when people witness genuine compassion, and even the officers seemed moved, their stern expressions softening as they watched a judge not merely enforce the law, but embrace the responsibility of being a protector of the vulnerable. By the time Judge Caprio finished, the woman's tears had already begun to fall, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar relief of being understood, seen, and treated with dignity she hadn't felt in a long time. Just as the courtroom began to settle into the emotional weight of Judge Caprio's compassion, a sudden movement at the back of the room drew every eye in the same direction, as if the energy of the moment had been interrupted by an unseen force. The heavy wooden door opened slowly, and a man stepped inside, broad-shouldered, unshaven, wearing a hood pulled low over his forehead, his posture tense in a way that instantly set every officer on alert. The mother's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her breath hitched sharply, her body jerked involuntarily, and her hand shot protectively in front of her son, whose small fingers clutched her jacket in instinctive fear. Judge Caprio noticed her sudden panic, and though he didn't yet understand the reason, his eyes followed hers to the stranger who was now standing rigidly against the wall, scanning the room with cold, searching eyes. The man's gaze locked onto the mother, and a chilling recognition passed between them, silent exchange, heavy with history, accusation, and threat. One of the officers subtly shifted his stance, hand hovering near his holster, sensing danger without needing explanation. The mother's lips trembled as she whispered, barely audible, "He wasn't supposed to know we were here." Those words struck Judge Caprio like a blow, and the truth snapped into place faster than any file or testimony ever could. This wasn't just an ex-partner. This was the man she had been running from, the one whose shadow had stretched over every missed court date, every sleepless night, every fearful glance she had made toward the door since she entered the courtroom. The man took one slow step forward, his jaw tightening, his eyes fixed on her with a possessiveness that made several officers instinctively move closer. The child pressed his face into his mother's side, his small body trembling, and the woman wrapped her arm around him as though bracing for impact. Judge Caprio rose slightly from his seat, his voice steady but sharp as he ordered the man to stay exactly where he was, and for the first time, the courtroom felt less like a legal chamber and more like a battleground, one where truth, fear, authority, and protection collided in a single breath. The man hesitated, his expression shifting between anger and calculation. And in that instant, every person in the room understood that this case was no longer about violations or fines. It had become a matter of safety, of danger, of a mother and child facing the very threat they had been trying to escape. The moment the tension between the mother and the intruding man became unmistakable, the entire courtroom shifted into a unified pulse of concern, fear, and protective instinct. Spectators who moments earlier were passive observers now leaned forward with expressions ranging from shock to anger. Their breaths collectively held as they tried to make sense of the sudden threat unfolding before them. A woman in the back row, covered her mouth with her hands. Her eyes filled with empathy for the trembling child who clung desperately to his mother's side, while an elderly man near the front shook his head slowly, his face etched with the kind of sorrow reserved for witnessing injustice up close. Even the officers, men and women accustomed to conflict, trained for chaos, looked visibly affected as they witnessed the terror in the young mother's eyes, the kind of terror that spoke of years of silent suffering. One officer subtly stepped closer, positioning himself between the man and the podium with a protective instinct that seemed to spread like a wave. Others followed, their movements calm but deliberate, forming a barrier that didn't need explaining. Whispers rippled through the courtroom's soft, horrified murmurs of, "Is that him?" and "Oh my God." But even those whispers quickly faded when Judge Caprio raised his hand, signaling for silence. Yet the silence that followed was not the sterile quiet of a courtroom waiting for procedure. It was a heavy, emotional stillness filled with collective outrage, sympathy, and the growing realization that the case they had all assumed was simple had led them into the middle of a mother's private nightmare. Some spectators exchanged tearful glances as the child whimpered softly, burying his face in his mother's coat while she wrapped her arms protectively around him, her entire body shaking as she fought to keep herself composed in front of strangers. The officers nearest the man stood taller, steadier, their presence sending a clear message that the mother and child were no longer alone. And in the center of it all, Judge Caprio remained standing, his eyes scanning the room, absorbing not only the fear of the mother, but the unified protective energy emanating from everyone present, an unspoken promise from the courtroom itself that whatever happened next, compassion and justice would not allow fear to win. Judge Frank Caprio remained standing for a long moment, his hand resting firmly on the bench as he took in the fear etched into the young mother's trembling shoulders and the way her son clung to her, as if she were the only shield he had left in the world. The officers continued holding their protective positions, and the man at the back of the courtroom, her ex-partner, stood stiff and silent, his presence dripping with hostility. The judge's expression shifted into one of resolute authority, the kind that reminded everyone in the room that while he was known for kindness, he held an unshakable commitment to justice when lives were at risk. He addressed the man first, his voice low but powerful, warning him that any step forward, any attempt to intimidate, or any interference with the proceedings would result in his immediate arrest. The man's defiance flickered, but the presence of multiple officers made him freeze in place. With that danger contained, Judge Caprio turned back toward the mother, his features softening with a profound empathy that quieted the entire room. He told her that no citation, no missed court date, and no fine in the world compared to the safety of a mother and her child, and therefore, effective immediately, all her fines would be dismissed with prejudice. Her lips parted in disbelief, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as he continued, explaining that her missed court appearances were not acts of negligence but acts of survival, and that the justice system existed not to punish people drowning in hardship, but to lift them when their lives had become too heavy to carry alone. Then, with a tone that carried both compassion and unwavering resolve, he stated that he would be forwarding her case to the appropriate domestic protection service, ensuring immediate legal steps were taken to safeguard her and her son from future harm. An officer approached her gently, promising to escort her safely to her car after the hearing, and another began documenting the man's threatening presence for further action. The room seemed to exhale as Judge Caprio finished his verdict, and spectators who had been silently praying for her safety wiped their eyes, witnessing a moment where justice did not simply follow the lit, honored humanity. The mother's knees buckled slightly, overcome with relief, and her son wrapped his tiny arms around her waist, whispering something only she could hear. And in that moment, as her tears finally fell freely, Judge Caprio offered her a soft, reassuring nod, a reminder that even in the darkest places, compassion still held power, And in this courtroom, at least for today, fear had lost. As the courtroom slowly returned to motion, the emotional weight of what had just unfolded seemed to linger in the air like a soft echo, touching every person who had witnessed the moment, when a struggling mother was finally shown the compassion she had been denied for so long. The young woman stood there trembling, her tears falling freely now. Not from fear, but from the staggering relief of realizing that someone with authority, someone who mattered, had finally listened, understood, and protected her. Her son pressed his face into her stomach, tiny arms wrapped around her as if grounding her in the reality that their nightmare might finally be ending. She knelt down to him, pulling him close, whispering shaky words of comfort that cracked with emotion. And the child clung to her with a quiet understanding far beyond his age. The officers who had formed the protective barrier around them relaxed slightly, but their eyes stayed focused on her ex-partner, who was now being carefully watched and prepared for removal from the courtroom. A few spectators wiped their eyes, moved by a scene that reminded them why Judge Caprio's courtroom had become a symbol of hope for so many, because it wasn't just a place where laws were enforced, but where humanity was honored. As the mother gathered her scattered paperwork with trembling hands, one officer gently offered to carry her things, another offered water, and a third assured her that she and her son would be escorted safely all the way home if needed. She looked up at Judge Caprio with eyes full of gratitude, unable to find the words to express what his actions meant to her. But he gave her a warm, fatherly smile, as if to say she didn't need to explain anything. Her relief was enough. In that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between the man, understanding that her life, for the first time in a long time, had shifted toward something safer, something brighter, something hopeful. As she turned to leave the courtroom, guiding her son gently by the hand, the heaviness that once surrounded her had begun to lift. And though the road ahead would still hold challenges, she no longer walked it alone. For the first time in months, maybe even years, she stepped forward, not with fear, but with a fragile, newfound courage, knowing that kindness still existed, and that today it had saved her as the mother and her child walked out of the courtroom under the watchful care of the officers, leaving behind the shadows of fear that had haunted them for so long. The room slowly settled into a reflective silence, the kind that stays with people long after they leave their seats. What everyone had just witnessed was more than a legal decision. It was a reminder that compassion still has the power to transform lives. That kindness can be an anchor for someone drowning in circumstances they never chose. And that sometimes all a person needs is for one voice to say, "You're safe now." Judge Frank Caprio gathered his papers quietly, his face lined not with exhaustion, but with the soft, resolute calm of a man who knows that justice is most meaningful when it is paired with humanity. And as the doors finally closed behind the mother and her son, a gentle truth settled into the room. Today, the law had protected someone who desperately needed protecting. If you believe the world needs more moments like this, moments where fear is replaced with courage, where suffering is met with understanding, and where a single act of compassion can change the course of someone's life, then let this story be a reminder of the difference you can make just by sharing it. Share it so others remember that kindness still matters. Share it so someone facing their own silent battles knows they are not alone. And if you want to stand with us in telling more stories where justice meets humanity, where ordinary people find extraordinary strength, then join us, subscribe, and help keep these stories alive, because somewhere out there, someone may need exactly this reminder today.